The courtroom was quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights above and the occasional shuffle of papers. It wasn't a grand or imposing space, just a modest room with wooden benches that creaked under the weight of people sitting on them. The judge's bench stood slightly elevated at the front, giving Judge Richard Caldwell a commanding view of everyone present. He adjusted his glasses as he flipped through the case file in front of him, his expression already one of mild irritation. Today's docket included a seemingly minor zoning dispute involving Karoline Leavitt, a local woman accused of building an extension on her property without proper permits. To most observers, it appeared to be just another routine matter. But for Karoline, it was anything but ordinary. She sat stiffly beside her husband, Daniel Leavitt, clutching a folder filled with documents she hoped would help her case. Her knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly. Daniel, on the other hand, looked out of place. He wore a plain gray sweater and jeans, his brown hair slightly messy as if he hadn't bothered combing it that morning. His posture was slouched and his hands rested awkwardly on his lap. He glanced around the room nervously, taking in the rows of curious faces watching the proceedings. For someone attending court, he didn't seem prepared, or even particularly interested. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat loudly, drawing everyone's attention. "Next case," he announced, glancing down at the file. "Karoline Leavitt versus the City of Maplewood. Counsel for the city?" A tall man in a dark suit stood up immediately. His nameplate read, Mr. Harold Jenkins, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. "Your Honor," Jenkins began, bowing slightly. "The city alleges that Ms. Leavitt violated municipal zoning regulations by constructing an unauthorized addition to her home. This action not only disregards established laws, but also poses potential safety risks to her neighborhood." Karoline shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She wanted to say something, to explain that the extension was necessary because their growing family needed more space, but she bit her tongue. Instead, she nudged Daniel gently, urging him to speak up. After all, they couldn't afford a lawyer, and Daniel had agreed to represent them since he used to work in law. Sort of. "Does the defendant have legal representation?" Judge Caldwell asked, raising an eyebrow as he scanned the room. Karoline hesitated before speaking. "No, Your Honor. My husband will be representing us." The judge turned his gaze toward Daniel, who suddenly felt every pair of eyes in the room boring into him. He sat up straighter, trying to appear more composed, but it was too late. Judge Caldwell's lip curled slightly as he studied the man. "You're handling this case yourself, Mr. Leavitt?" the judge asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied, his voice barely audible over the murmurs in the gallery. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "I'll do my best to present our side." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Well, Mr. Leavitt, I hope your best is good enough. These matters can get complicated quickly." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and several people in the audience exchanged amused glances. It was clear the judge didn't think much of Daniel's abilities. Jenkins wasted no time launching into his argument. With practiced ease, he outlined the city's case against Karoline, citing specific sections of the municipal code and presenting photographs of the disputed addition. He spoke confidently, using terms like non-compliance and structural integrity, as if they were weapons designed to intimidate. By the time he finished, the judge was nodding approvingly. When it came time for Daniel to respond, he rose slowly to his feet. His palms were sweaty and his heart pounded in his chest. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. Still, he took a deep breath and began. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steadier. "Now, my wife and I understand the importance of following rules. We didn't intend to break any laws when we built the extension. Our goal was simply to create a safe and functional space for our children." Before he could continue, Judge Caldwell interrupted. "Intentions don't change facts, Mr. Leavitt. Either you followed the law or you didn't. Do you have evidence to support your claim that this construction complies with city regulations?" Daniel faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the direct question. He fumbled with the folder in front of him, searching for the right document. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, and Jenkins smirked smugly from his seat. Finally, Daniel found what he was looking for, a letter from a contractor stating that the work met basic safety standards. "Here, Your Honor," he said, holding it up. "This shows that the structure is sound and poses no danger to anyone." Caldwell barely glanced at the paper before dismissing it. "That's not sufficient proof of compliance with zoning laws, Mr. Leavitt. You'll need more than a vague assurance from a contractor." The comment drew a few chuckles from the audience, and Daniel flushed red with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to argue further, but the judge cut him off again. "Let's move on. Perhaps you'd like to cross-examine Mr. Jenkins." Daniel blinked, unsure of what to do next. Cross-examination? He hadn't prepared for something like that. Panic bubbled inside him as he realized how unprepared he truly was. But then, something shifted. A spark ignited in his mind, faint but unmistakable. Years of buried knowledge began surfacing, fragments of strategies and techniques he thought he'd forgotten. Summoning whatever courage he had left, Daniel turned to Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins," he started, his voice firmer now. "You mentioned earlier that the extension violates Section 4B of the Municipal Code. Could you clarify which part specifically applies to our situation?" Jenkins frowned, clearly not expecting such a precise question. He shuffled through his notes, stalling for time. "Well, it pertains to the height restrictions outlined in subsection 3. And does that section explicitly state that structures exceeding 10 feet require approval?" Daniel pressed, sensing an opening. "It implies it," Jenkins replied, his confidence wavering slightly. "But implying isn't the same as stating," Daniel countered, gaining momentum. "Unless there's explicit language prohibiting the exact dimensions of our addition, how can the city justify claiming noncompliance?" The room fell silent. Even Judge Caldwell raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. Jenkins sputtered, struggling to recover. That's beside the point," he stammered. "The spirit of the law." "The spirit of the law doesn't override its actual wording," Daniel interrupted, surprising even himself with his boldness. "If the city wants to enforce these rules, they need to provide clearer guidelines." For the first time that day, Jenkins looked rattled. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, studying Daniel with renewed interest. There was something different about this man, something unexpected. Whatever it was, it made the rest of the hearing far more interesting than anyone had anticipated. As the session adjourned for a short recess, whispers filled the courtroom. People speculated about Daniel's background, wondering how an unassuming man like him could hold his own against a seasoned attorney. Karoline squeezed her husband's hand, pride shining in her eyes. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. Maybe, just maybe, he still had it in him to make a difference, after all. When the recess ended, the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. People had expected the hearing to be a quick and predictable affair, but Daniel Leavitt's unexpected pushback during Jenkins's testimony had turned it into something far more intriguing. Even Judge Caldwell seemed more alert now, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced by cautious curiosity. Karoline sat beside Daniel, gripping his arm tightly for reassurance. She could feel the tension radiating from him, but there was also a strange sense of focus in his demeanor. It was as if he had tapped into some hidden reservoir of confidence, one that neither she nor anyone else in the room had seen before. For her part, Karoline felt a mix of pride and worry. She knew how much this case meant to their family, but she couldn't shake the fear that Daniel might still be out of his depth. As the session resumed, Jenkins stood up again, determined to regain control. He adjusted his tie and addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, "while Mr. Leavitt raises valid points about interpretation, the fact remains that Ms. Leavitt failed to seek proper approval for her construction. This is a clear violation of procedure, regardless of technicalities." Judge Caldwell nodded thoughtfully. "Proceed, Mr. Jenkins." Jenkins then called the city's lead inspector, Mr. Alan Foster, to the stand. Foster was a stout man in his 50s with a clipboard, perpetually tucked under his arm. He took the oath and settled into the witness chair, looking every bit the reliable authority figure the prosecution hoped he would appear. "Mr. Foster," Jenkins asked, pacing slowly in front of the witness stand, "can you confirm whether Ms. Leavitt obtained the necessary permits for the extension on her property?" "No, sir, she did not," Foster replied firmly. "We conducted multiple inspections over the past year, and no permit applications were submitted for that structure." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Jenkins allowed himself a small smile, confident that this testimony would seal the case against Karoline. But Daniel wasn't ready to concede just yet. When it came time for cross-examination, he rose to his feet once again. "Mr. Foster," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach, "you mentioned conducting inspections. Can you tell us exactly when those inspections occurred?" Foster flipped through his notes. "The first inspection was on March 15th, followed by another on May 3rd. Daniel nodded, jotting down the dates. "And during these inspections, did you personally inform my wife that her construction required a permit?" Foster hesitated for a moment. "I may not have spoken directly to her, but we sent official notices via mail." "So you're saying you never spoke to her face-to-face?" Daniel pressed. "That's correct," Foster admitted reluctantly. Daniel turned to the judge. "Your Honor, if the city claims to prioritize compliance, shouldn't they ensure that property owners are properly informed? Sending a letter isn't enough, especially if it gets lost or overlooked." The judge frowned slightly, considering the point. Jenkins stepped forward, clearly annoyed. "Objection, Your Honor. The responsibility lies with the homeowner to stay informed." "Overruled," Judge Caldwell said after a pause. "Continue, Mr. Leavitt." Encouraged, Daniel returned his attention to Foster. "Mr. Foster, can you confirm whether the city provides any assistance or guidance to homeowners who want to apply for permits?" "We offer informational brochures at the municipal office," Foster replied stiffly. "But nothing more proactive?" Daniel asked. "No outreach programs, workshops, or follow-ups to ensure people understand the process?" Foster shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Not at this time, no." Daniel let the silence hang for a moment before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe this highlights a critical issue. The city expects citizens to comply with complex regulations but offers minimal support to help them do so. Is it fair to penalize someone like my wife when the system itself is flawed?" The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Jenkins looked increasingly flustered, while Judge Caldwell leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Daniel's argument was starting to gain traction, and even the audience seemed sympathetic to Karoline's plight. After dismissing Foster, Jenkins tried to salvage the prosecution's case by presenting additional evidence. He introduced photos of the extension, claiming it obstructed public pathways and violated aesthetic guidelines. Each piece of evidence seemed damning at first glance, but Daniel countered with surprising precision. "Your Honor," Daniel said, pointing to one of the photographs, "this photo appears to show the extension encroaching on a sidewalk. However, if you look closely, the shadow suggests the angle has been distorted. Without accurate measurements, this image doesn't prove anything." Jenkins bristled. "Are you accusing us of tampering with evidence?" "I'm simply pointing out that visual representations can be misleading without proper context," Daniel replied calmly. "If the city wants to make its case, it needs to provide verifiable data." The exchange left Jenkins visibly rattled. For all his polished arguments and rehearsed delivery, he hadn't anticipated facing someone who could dismantle his claims so effectively. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the momentum had shifted noticeably in Daniel's favor. When it came time for Daniel to present his side, he approached the podium with newfound determination. He started by addressing the core issue: why the extension had been built in the first place. "Your Honor, my wife and I didn't undertake this project lightly," he explained. "Our family has grown, and our current home no longer meets our needs. The extension was intended to create a safe and functional space for our children, a bedroom and a small play area. We acted out of necessity, not defiance." He went on to highlight the steps they had taken to ensure the construction was safe and compliant. We hired a licensed contractor who assured us the work adhered to all relevant codes. While we acknowledged the oversight regarding permits, we believed we were acting responsibly based on the information available to us. To bolster his argument, Daniel presented letters from neighbors attesting to the quality of the work and expressing support for the Leavitts. One neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Monroe, described the extension as a thoughtful addition that posed no threat to the community. Another praised Karoline and Daniel as model residents who contributed positively to the neighborhood. As Daniel wrapped up his presentation, Judge Caldwell studied him intently. There was no denying the transformation that had taken place over the course of the hearing. The awkward, hesitant man who had entered the courtroom hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone articulate, composed, and deeply knowledgeable. It was almost as if Daniel had shed years of self-doubt in real time, revealing the skilled advocate beneath. Before adjourning for the day, the judge announced that he would need time to review the evidence before delivering a verdict. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the session, the courtroom erupted into chatter. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, eager to capture the details of what had become an unexpectedly dramatic trial. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd gathered around Daniel and Karoline. Some offered words of encouragement while others peppered them with questions. Local journalist Emily Carter pushed her way to the front, microphone in hand. "Mr. Leavitt, where did you learn to argue like that? You don't seem like a typical lawyer." Daniel hesitated, unsure how to respond. The truth was complicated, and he wasn't ready to share it. Not yet. Instead, he offered a simple answer. "I've always believed in standing up for what's right. Sometimes you just have to trust yourself." Karoline beamed at him, her earlier worries melting away. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. Her husband was capable of far more than either of them had realized. And as they walked away from the courthouse together, Daniel couldn't help but wonder if this was only the beginning of something bigger. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts about the case and everything that had happened the day before. For years, he had avoided anything remotely connected to his old life in law. The memories of long hours spent poring over legal texts, arguing in courtrooms, and navigating the murky waters of ethics still lingered uncomfortably. But now, those skills were flooding back to him, almost as if they had been waiting patiently for their chance to resurface. Karoline stirred beside him, her voice sleepy but warm. "You okay?" she asked, reaching out to touch his arm. "I'm fine," Daniel replied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated before answering. "About how much things have changed and how little I've really changed." Karoline propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face. "You did amazing yesterday, Daniel. I mean it. You stood up for us when no one else could. That's not something to take lightly." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. It's just, this isn't who I wanted to be anymore. Or at least it wasn't supposed to be." "But maybe it is who you're meant to be," Karoline said softly. "Sometimes we don't get to choose where our talents lead us." Her words stayed with him as he got dressed and prepared for the day. By the time they arrived at the courthouse, reporters were already gathered outside, eager for updates on the unfolding drama. Emily Carter, the journalist from the previous day, spotted them immediately and hurried over. "Mr. Leavitt," she called, holding up her recorder. "Can I ask you a few questions?" Daniel glanced at Karoline, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Sure," he said reluctantly. Carter wasted no time diving in. "There's been a lot of talk about your performance in court yesterday. Some people are saying you might have professional experience. Is that true?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Let's just say I've had some background in law. Beyond that, I'd prefer to keep my personal history private." Carter pressed further. "Do you think your past experience gives you an edge in this case?" "It helps me understand the system better," Daniel admitted. "But at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's about making sure justice is served. Satisfied, for now, Carter thanked him and stepped back, scribbling notes furiously. As they entered the courthouse, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the spotlight was growing brighter by the minute. He hadn't anticipated this level of attention, and it made him uneasy. Inside, Judge Caldwell presided over another packed courtroom. Word had spread quickly about the surprising turn of events, drawing curious spectators and even a few local attorneys who wanted to see Daniel in action. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as the session began. Judge Caldwell addressed the room first. Before we proceed, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a spectacle. Let's maintain decorum. His eyes lingered briefly on Daniel before moving on. Jenkins rose to deliver his closing arguments. He spoke passionately about the importance of following rules and maintaining order within communities. Laws exist for a reason, he declared. They protect us all. If individuals can simply ignore them without consequence, chaos will follow. It was a compelling argument, delivered with practiced eloquence. Jenkins clearly hoped to sway the judge, and perhaps the public opinion, back in his favor. When he finished, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Daniel's response. Daniel approached the podium slowly, gathering his thoughts. He knew this was his last opportunity to make a strong impression. Taking a deep breath, he began. Your Honor, I respect Mr. Jenkins's dedication to enforcing the law. Laws are indeed vital. They provide structure and fairness. But laws also need to serve the people they govern. When enforcement becomes rigid and impersonal, it loses sight of its purpose. He paused, letting his words sink in. My wife and I didn't set out to break any rules. We acted because we needed a solution for our family. Yes, we made mistakes along the way, and we accept responsibility for those. But punishing us harshly won't fix the underlying issues. Instead, it would punish honest people trying to do their best in a confusing and often inaccessible system. Daniel turned toward Jenkins, his tone firm but respectful. If the city truly cares about compliance, it should focus on education and support, not punishment. Make the process easier to navigate. Provide clear guidance and resources. Help people succeed instead of setting them up to fail. His voice softened as he concluded. We're not asking for special treatment, we're asking for fairness. And we believe that fairness starts with understanding. The courtroom fell silent. Even Jenkins looked momentarily speechless, unsure how to counter such a heartfelt appeal. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he announced that he would deliver his verdict after lunch. During the recess, Daniel and Karoline found a quiet corner to sit together. They didn't speak much, both lost in their own thoughts. Karoline held Daniel's hand tightly, silently reminding him that whatever happened, they were in this together. As they returned to the courtroom, rumors swirled about what the judge might decide. Some speculated that Daniel's arguments had been too persuasive to ignore, while others believed Jenkins' emphasis on strict enforcement would carry more weight. The tension was palpable as everyone took their seats. When Judge Caldwell re-entered the room, the murmuring ceased instantly. He shuffled through his papers, taking his time before addressing the court. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, he began, his voice steady and authoritative. I find that Ms. Leavitt did violate municipal zoning regulations by failing to obtain proper permits for her construction. However, he paused, looking directly at Daniel. I also recognize the mitigating circumstances outlined by Mr. Leavitt. Therefore, I am granting Ms. Leavitt 30 days to retroactively apply for the necessary permits. Additionally, I urge the city to implement clearer guidelines and outreach programs to assist residents in navigating these processes. The gallery erupted into applause, though Judge Caldwell quickly silenced them with a sharp tap of his gavel. Court is adjourned. For a moment, Daniel simply stood there, stunned. Then Karoline threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. We did it, she whispered. You did it. Outside, reporters swarmed them once again, firing questions left and right. This time, Daniel didn't shy away. He answered calmly and confidently, knowing that his actions had sparked a conversation far bigger than their individual case. But as the excitement settled, Daniel couldn't help but reflect on what this victory meant, not just for him and Karoline, but for everyone who felt trapped by unfair systems. Maybe, he thought, this was a sign that it was time to step back into the world he had left behind, not for himself, but for others who needed someone to fight for them. The days following the verdict were a whirlwind for Daniel and Karoline. What had started as a small legal battle over zoning violations had snowballed into something much larger. The local news couldn't get enough of the story, with headlines like "Unlikely Hero Wins Courtroom Battle" and "Small-Town Man Takes on City Hall and Wins." Reporters camped outside their modest home, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had outsmarted seasoned attorneys and earned praise from Judge Caldwell. At first, Daniel tried to ignore the attention. He went about his daily routine, helping Karoline tidy up the house and playing with their children in the backyard. But it was impossible to escape the growing buzz around him. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate him, strangers approached him at the grocery store, and even old acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in years reached out. Everyone wanted to know more about the quiet man who had suddenly become a local celebrity. One afternoon, as Daniel sat on the porch sipping coffee, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patricia Monroe came knocking on the door. She was the same neighbor who had written a glowing letter of support during the trial. In her hands, she held a thick envelope. "Daniel," she said warmly, handing him the envelope. "A few of us have been talking, and we thought you might be able to help." Curious, Daniel opened it and found several handwritten letters inside. Each one described a different grievance: a tenant being evicted unfairly, a worker denied wages, a family struggling to pay medical bills after an insurance company refused coverage. They weren't big cases, but they mattered deeply to the people involved. "I'm not sure I can take this on," Daniel said hesitantly, looking up at Mrs. Monroe. "I haven't practiced law in years." She smiled kindly. "You don't need to convince me, dear. You already proved what you're capable of. Besides, these folks can't afford fancy lawyers. If anyone can make a difference, it's you." Her words echoed Karoline's earlier encouragement, planting a seed of doubt in Daniel's mind. Could he really turn his back on people who needed help? He thought about all the times he'd felt powerless in his old career, bogged down by bureaucracy and corruption. Maybe this was his chance to do things differently, to use his skills for good instead of profit. That evening over dinner, Daniel shared the letters with Karoline. She listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "Part of me wants to say no. I walked away from that life for a reason, but seeing how much these cases mean to people makes me wonder if I should try again, even if it's just for a little while." Karoline reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You've always been someone who fights for justice, Daniel. Even when you didn't think you could. Maybe this is your way of finding balance, helping others without losing yourself." Her words stayed with him long after the dishes were cleared. By the end of the week, Daniel made his decision. He would take on a few pro bono cases, starting with the ones Mrs. Monroe had brought him. It wasn't going to be easy, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose bubbling within him. Word spread quickly about Daniel's decision. Soon, more people began showing up at his doorstep, each carrying their own story of hardship. A young waitress named Lisa explained how her landlord had raised the rent illegally, forcing her to choose between paying bills or feeding her kids. An elderly man named Harold recounted how a hospital had overcharged him for procedures not covered under his Medicare plan. Every case tugged at Daniel's heartstrings, reminding him why he had pursued law in the first place. To manage the influx of requests, Daniel converted their spare bedroom into a makeshift office. He dusted off old textbooks, dug out forgotten notes, and spent hours researching laws and precedents. Karoline pitched in wherever she could, organizing files and answering phone calls. Together they formed a team, determined to give each case the attention it deserved. Daniel's approach was simple yet effective. He focused on clear communication, explaining complex legal terms in language his clients could understand. He encouraged them to share every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed, knowing that even the smallest fact could change the outcome of a case. And most importantly, he listened, really listened, to their stories, treating each person with dignity and respect. His success rate was remarkable. One by one, Daniel secured victories for his clients, whether it was negotiating fair settlements, filing restraining orders against abusive landlords, or challenging unjust fees. News of his achievements traveled fast, drawing even more people to his door. Before long, Daniel became known as the town's unofficial advocate, a modern-day champion for the underdog, but not everyone appreciated his efforts. Among those watching closely was Victor Langley, a wealthy real estate developer with deep ties to the city council. Langley had built his empire through aggressive tactics, including exploiting loopholes in zoning laws and pushing out small businesses to make room for luxury developments. For years, he had operated with near impunity, thanks to connections and bribes that kept officials in his pocket. When rumors reached Langley about Daniel's growing influence, he grew uneasy. If left unchecked, this amateur lawyer could expose the cracks in the system Langley relied on. Determined to shut Daniel down, Langley hired a high-profile attorney from out of state, a sharp-tongued litigator named Gregory Holt. Holt wasted no time filing a defamation lawsuit against Daniel, accusing him of spreading false information about Langley's business practices. According to the complaint, Daniel had allegedly accused Langley of corruption during interviews with reporters, tarnishing his reputation and causing financial harm. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the community. Many feared that Holt's arrival signaled the beginning of the end for Daniel's crusade. How could a self-taught lawyer possibly stand up to someone of Holt's caliber? Karoline was among the first to voice her concerns. "This isn't like the zoning case, Daniel," she said one evening, pacing the living room. She, Gregory Holt, was known for his ruthless efficiency and willingness to bend ethical lines to win. Facing him head-on would be a monumental challenge, especially given the resources Langley could throw into the fight. Yet, Daniel refused to back down. He saw the lawsuit for what it truly was, an attempt to silence him and intimidate others from speaking out. "This isn't just about me anymore," Daniel told Karoline firmly. "If I give in now, it sends a message that people like Langley can do whatever they want without consequences. We can't let that happen." With Karoline's support, Daniel threw himself into preparing for the trial. He pored over documents related to Langley's projects, searching for evidence of wrongdoing. He reached out to former employees, contractors, and residents affected by Langley's developments, piecing together a narrative of greed and exploitation. Slowly but surely, a pattern emerged, one that painted Langley as far from the respectable businessman he claimed to be. As the trial date approached, tensions ran high. Reporters descended on the town once again, eager to cover the David versus Goliath showdown. Supporters rallied behind Daniel, holding fundraisers and organizing protests outside Langley's properties. Meanwhile, Langley's allies worked tirelessly to discredit Daniel, spreading rumors and questioning his motives. On the morning of the trial, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Spectators lined the walls, straining to catch a glimpse of the action. Cameras flashed as Daniel entered, accompanied by Karoline and a small group of friends. Despite the overwhelming odds, Daniel carried himself with quiet confidence, his resolve unwavering. When the proceedings began, Holt launched into a scathing opening statement, painting Daniel as a reckless troublemaker bent on destroying Langley's livelihood. His tone was sharp and accusatory, designed to sway the jury before Daniel even had a chance to speak. But when it was Daniel's turn, he rose calmly, meeting the eyes of everyone in the room. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice steady and clear. "This case isn't about me or Mr. Langley. It's about truth versus power, about whether ordinary people have the right to speak up when they see injustice, or whether fear will keep them silent." He then presented his evidence, laying out a damning timeline of Langley's actions. From forged permits to illegal evictions, the picture he painted was undeniable. The courtroom fell silent as Daniel spoke, his words resonating with everyone present. By the time he finished, the tide had shifted. Even Holt seemed rattled, scrambling to counter Daniel's arguments. But it was too late. The damage had been done. When the verdict came in, it was unanimous. Langley's lawsuit was dismissed, and the judge issued a stern warning about using litigation to stifle free speech. Cheers erupted in the courtroom, and tears streamed down faces as people hugged one another in relief. For Daniel, the victory was bittersweet. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be others like Langley, ready to exploit the vulnerable. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of triumph, knowing he had sparked a movement that would continue long after the headlines faded. As he stepped out of the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the outcome, but for the reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage and integrity could light the way forward. The victory over Victor Langley marked a turning point for Daniel Leavitt. What had started as a personal battle to defend his wife and family had grown into something far greater, a movement that inspired others to stand up against injustice. The town of Maplewood, once quiet and unassuming, now buzzed with conversations about fairness, accountability, and the power of ordinary people to make a difference. For weeks after the trial, Daniel found himself at the center of attention. Reporters continued to follow him, eager to document every step of his journey. Local businesses hung signs in their windows thanking him for his efforts, and strangers stopped him on the street to shake his hand or share their gratitude. It was overwhelming at times, but Daniel couldn't deny the sense of fulfillment he felt. For the first time in years, he believed he was doing meaningful work that aligned with his values. Karoline watched her husband closely during this period. She saw how much energy he poured into helping others, but she also noticed the toll it took on him. Late nights spent researching cases, early mornings answering calls from desperate clients, and the constant pressure to deliver results left little room for rest. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Karoline decided it was time to say something. "Daniel," she began gently, "you've done so much already. When are you going to take a break?" He chuckled softly, rubbing his temples. "I don't think there's time for breaks right now. There's always someone who needs help." "I know," Karoline replied, placing a hand on his arm. "But if you burn yourself out, you won't be able to help anyone, not even us." Her words struck a chord. Daniel realized she was right. He had been so focused on fixing problems for others that he hadn't considered what it might cost him or his family in the long run. That night, as they tucked their children into bed, Daniel made a silent promise to find balance. He would continue fighting for justice, but he wouldn't let it consume him entirely. In the months that followed, Daniel made changes to how he approached his work. Instead of taking on every case that came his way, he learned to prioritize those that truly needed his expertise. He formed partnerships with local nonprofits and legal aid organizations, ensuring that people who couldn't afford representation still had access to resources. Together, they created workshops and informational sessions to educate residents about their rights, one of the key issues Daniel had highlighted during the zoning trial. Karoline played an integral role in these efforts. Her organizational skills kept everything running smoothly, while her warmth and empathy helped ease the fears of those seeking assistance. The couple worked side by side, their bond stronger than ever. Even their children began pitching in, drawing posters for community events and cheering on their parents' mission. As word of Daniel's success spread beyond Maplewood, invitations started pouring in from neighboring towns. People wanted him to speak at rallies, lead seminars, and even consult on larger-scale legal battles. At first, Daniel hesitated, unsure if he was ready to expand his reach. But Karoline encouraged him to embrace the opportunity, reminding him that his message could inspire change far beyond their small community. One such invitation came from a nearby city grappling with widespread housing discrimination. Developers. There had systematically pushed low-income families out of affordable neighborhoods, replacing them with luxury condos catering to wealthier buyers. A grassroots coalition had formed to fight back, and they hoped Daniel would join their cause. After much deliberation, Daniel agreed to lend his support. He traveled to the city several times a week, working alongside activists, attorneys, and affected residents to build a case against the developers. The experience was eye-opening, exposing him to the broader systemic issues plaguing marginalized communities. It reinforced his belief that true justice required not just individual victories but systemic reform. Back home, life carried on in its own rhythm. Neighbors continued to seek Daniel's advice, though many were referred to newly trained volunteers who had taken up the mantle of advocacy. The makeshift office in the spare bedroom was replaced by a proper workspace at the local community center, funded by donations from grateful supporters. Daniel visited regularly, offering guidance and mentoring newcomers eager to learn. Despite his growing influence, Daniel remained humble. He never sought recognition or accolades. His motivation came from seeing the impact of his work. Whether it was a single mother keeping her apartment, a worker receiving overdue wages, or a neighborhood preserving its character, each success fueled his determination to keep going. Eventually, Judge Caldwell reached out to Daniel, inviting him to a private meeting. The two men met at a small cafe near the courthouse, exchanging polite greetings before settling into conversation. "You've caused quite a stir around here," Caldwell said with a wry smile, sipping his coffee. "I must admit I didn't see this coming when we first crossed paths." Daniel laughed softly. "Neither did I, Your Honor. To be honest, I wasn't planning on any of this." Caldwell nodded thoughtfully. "Still, you've accomplished something remarkable. You've reminded people that the law isn't just for the powerful, it's for everyone." "Thank you," Daniel replied, touched by the judge's words. "That's all I ever wanted, to level the playing field even just a little." The judge leaned forward, his expression serious. "You know, there's talk about nominating you for a position on the city's legal advisory board. They're looking for someone with your perspective, someone who understands the struggles of everyday people." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Me? On the advisory board?" "Why not?" Caldwell asked. "You've proven you have the knowledge, the integrity, and the heart for it. Besides, your voice is needed now more than ever." It was a tempting offer, one that could amplify Daniel's impact significantly, but he knew accepting it would mean stepping further into the public eye, a prospect that still made him uneasy. After discussing it with Karoline, however, he decided to give it a try. If nothing else, it would provide another platform to advocate for change. Years later, Daniel looked back on his journey with a mix of pride and humility. The small-town man who had once shied away from conflict had become a symbol of hope for countless individuals. His name appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and speeches celebrating grassroots activism. Yet despite the fame, Daniel never lost sight of what mattered most: his family, his principles, and the belief that everyone deserved a fair shot. On due. A crisp autumn morning, Daniel stood outside the community center where it had all begun. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter filling the air. Inside, volunteers bustled about, preparing for yet another workshop. As he watched, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace. He had started this journey to protect his family, but along the way he had discovered a purpose bigger than himself. Karoline joined him, wrapping an arm around his waist. "Proud of you," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Proud of us," Daniel corrected, kissing the top of her head. "We did this together." And as they walked away, hand in hand, Daniel knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they always had, with courage, love, and an unshakable commitment to doing what was right.